As a result of a 2020 state law, New Yorkers are gaining new insights into the behavior of police officers and their departments based on the analysis of disciplinary records that were made available to the public for the first time. And while the New York State Police are fighting the release of these records, that hasn't stopped intrepid reporters like my next guest from searching for documentation that still speaks to their internal operations, including how they handle misconduct. And for at least a partial look at how the state police leadership discipline their own, I'm joined by investigative fellow Sammy Sussman, who in a piece for New York Focus and the New York Times found that troopers received lax penalties for serious cases of misconduct. So, as I mentioned at the top, there are supposed to be troves of disciplinary records accessible to the public as a result of a transparency law that made its way through Albany in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in 2020. But as you note in your piece, the New York State Police are not exactly bending over backwards to comply with this law. So can you talk a little bit about the records that you did gain access to for your reporting and what you can learn from those records?
The state police are, the second biggest law enforcement agency in the state, over 5,000 officers, offices in every county, over 200 stations around the state. And yet they're really the last big police agency that we've seen that's kind of resisted releasing these records when you go and request them directly from the agency. Despite these changes in state law and, with most of the departments, you can go request them. But because they're kind of resisting that, I instead went to county district attorneys' offices and asked them for any records that each county district attorney had under this there's a Supreme Court case called Brady v. Maryland. And under Brady, a district attorney has to disclose to a criminal defendant any potentially impeachable material about any officers involved in a court case. Under Brady, district attorneys keep records of misconduct by officers in their general region on hand in New York. And so by going to county district attorneys around the state and ask them for their Brady materials about the state police, I could start to get records of misconduct by troopers in different counties around the state and then put them back together to get a comprehensive picture of misconduct and discipline in the state police.
Well, you looked at state police records that the district attorney's offices had from 2014 to 2024 and concluded that there was a weaker disciplinary system than what was employed in other large police departments in New York. How did the New York State Police stand out in their practices based on your review?
Compared to other large departments, right? Because I think with small departments, you see different disciplinary issues. But
Sure.
compared to other large departments around the state police are just more inconsistent in their punishment and generally more lax, although occasionally punishments are incredibly severe. So we found three troopers who had sex when they were supposed to be on duty and were caught doing so. One trooper was suspended for 8 days. Another trooper was suspended for 90 days. And we were also surprised to learn that the trooper who was suspended for 8 days had previously been caught taking a photo of his genitalia in uniform when he was supposed to be on duty. So the trooper with more of a history of sexual misconduct related offenses only got an 8-day suspension, and the trooper who was caught having sex with someone in a parking lot got the 90-day suspension, right? So there's just gross discrepancies like that across the records. It's not in the piece, but we also looked at troopers who brought home their police canines and had the canines bite someone in their home. And we saw suspensions between no days of no days of suspension and 2 weeks of suspension handed down for similar offenses in that instance as well.
And why are you seeing these discrepancies? Is there not a rule book that says bring home your dog, face this penalty, take a picture of your genitalia, face this penalty? Or is it the case where everyone is making these decisions on the fly? And when I say everyone, who is responsible for, I guess, what these sort of lower level disciplinary proceedings, who's responsible for them?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that state police lack a disciplinary matrix, which a lot of other large agencies have. The NYPD most famously published a disciplinary matrix a couple of years ago, and that matrix clearly states that if you commit this type of offense, you get this type of punishment. So if you commit sexual misconduct with a member of the public, let's say, you get a 20-day suspension to termination. And there'll be mitigating factors and aggravating factors, but there's a clear guideline for the type of punishment that should be handed down. And the state police told me, I believe for the first time on the record, that they're still working to develop some guidelines, and they've been doing so since some point last year. But absent those guidelines, there's just no standard, was I guess the first finding, and that's very different than other large agencies. And then I think second, to answer your second question, Some of these offenses we also saw were being routed through the troop level disciplinary system, which is, I guess, they give the systems different numbers. So it's a lower level system that they try to use to address more minor incidents. We see a lot of car crashes where there's not serious injury that are addressed through that, or issues like someone lost their badge, they lost, I guess not a badge, but they lost an ID card, or
Mm.
they lost, a credit card that they used to buy gas for their vehicle. You see people sometimes they put something on top of a vehicle and then they drive away and it falls off, something like that, right? Like radios get broken. So this lower level system is meant to address misconduct like that, but occasionally it's being used by individual troops to address much more serious misconduct. And the problem with this lower level system is that it's a more informal disciplinary process. Rather than, these extensive disciplinary records, you'll see one-page letters where a troop commander will say, I spoke to you, meaning the trooper, about this incident. I discussed, these policies or what you should do differently next time, and I'm handing down a punishment. And that troop commander cannot hand down a punishment that exceeds 5 days of suspension or 5 days of lost vacation through that process. So the most severe case that we found that went through that process was a trooper who stunned a combative suspect with a taser and then held down the trigger on that taser for 33 seconds, which is over twice the amount of time that's considered incredibly dangerous and potentially fatal. And if you read the manufacturer's instructions, they say that they've not tested the taser over 15 seconds. They believe that 15 seconds is linked to fatalities, and they've never done a test over 15 seconds to even determine the degree of fatality. And this trooper held it for over twice that. But that trooper was not even suspended for a week because it was handled through this lower level process.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're speaking with investigative journalist Sammy Sussman. So, for their part, the state police argue that in a lot of these cases there might be extenuating circumstances, and you have to look at a person's individual history, and all of that contributes to why they need to have flexibility and why you might see a lack of consistency in their punishments and how they handle different examples of misconduct. That's their side of things. Is there anyone who is critical of the status quo? Are there any watchdogs, for example, who argue that this is not the best practice and that this should be handled a different way?
Yeah, I spoke to a couple of experts who study police discipline both in New York and around the country. And they all say that this process really stands out because it's just not consistent. With the one trooper who held the taser for 33 seconds, there's a one-page letter summarizing an informal conversation between that trooper and his commander that resulted in discipline of less than a week of suspension. In another case, you'll see an 80-page packet with, a detailed investigative report, multiple interviews on the record with transcripts, a review of evidence. And so on that basic level, there's just, very obvious discrepancies that experts would really point to. I also spoke to someone who served as a supervising investigator on the CCRB in New York City, the Civilian Review Board for the NYPD, and he had a lot of concerns about just the lax processes that I think that these records evidence. There's one way to look at this misconduct as though it's individual troopers who are committing misconduct and concerns over those troopers' ability to serve the state and all of that. But he said when you look at this at kind of a broader level, it just speaks to a lack of rigor around discipline. If you're seeing such discrepancies and such short reports in some instances and long reports in others, it's just not an agency, at least he would argue, or at least he was telling me from in his view, that is taking this as seriously as they should be compared to the NYPD or, other big agencies in this state and really around the country that have that outside civilian oversight.
Well, I found it intriguing that you looked into the state inspector general's office's relationship with the state police and their approach to misconduct. What sort of findings did they have about the disciplinary practices?
Yeah, so I guess two things to talk about there. First, the state inspector general, in every other law enforcement agency, or almost every other law enforcement agency in New York State, following a law that was passed in 2020, has to report 5 or more cases or complaints of misconduct against their officers to the Attorney General's Law Enforcement Misconduct Investigative Office. The Inspector General, though, because it oversees the state police, gets those reports instead from this, theoretically would get those reports. The state police was immune from that law requiring them to report to the attorney general. But I found that the inspector general does not investigate repeated complaints of misconduct. So there's kind of a loophole there and a lack of oversight that should potentially might be addressed. And I spoke to the legislator who wrote the law that created the attorney general's office, and he said that he wants to look into that. And in terms of what the inspector general has said when they've looked at individual incidents of misconduct, they looked into an incident of a trooper in a protection unit around the governor's office who had a romantic relationship with the governor's daughter, Governor Cuomo. And then another incident with a trooper who crashed a federally leased vehicle. And in both cases, the inspector general said that there were real issues with the state police's disciplinary process. And like they suggested that the state police institute a disciplinary checklist to just maintain some consistency in how the disciplinary process unfolds. They spoke to issues with just lack of guidelines and kind of haphazard processes. They offered some recommendations for how the state police can reform. The state police say that they have, and these reports are 3, or I guess now 4 years old, given that we're in 2026. But there are just some basic issues that the inspector general raised when they've looked at these processes. And I think it's also important to note that the inspector general is not the first agency to raise real concerns with the disciplinary process in the state police, going all the way back to 1997 during an evidence tampering scandal in the state police. A special prosecutor who looked into them clearly identified the troop level misconduct process as something that should not be used for serious misconduct. So I found that, going all the way back to 1997, people have discouraged this kind of lower level process from being used to address serious misconduct, but that practice has continued to some degree to today.
Well, you alluded to the state police working on some sort of disciplinary matrix, but in general, from your conversations with stakeholders, state police, interviews that I imagine didn't make it into the story, but maybe inform the way you think about this, does there seem to be any reason to think the status quo is going to be changing anytime soon in the state police?
I mean, the Times Union has done great reporting about this, but there's definitely some signs of dissension, I think, within the ranks of the state police. You're seeing kind of the rank and file troopers be a little skeptical of their administration. They gave me a quote for the article about that, but also, the Times Union reported on the Ryder Cup scandal and a couple of resignations up top. That's kind of a factor in terms of what might change. But, they would say that they are working to reform and that we just haven't seen the guidelines that their counsel's office is developing. I think they would also argue that these records are a little bit old because of the way that I request them. I have records that are a couple years old at this point because it took them some time to get them back. But I think they would argue that those records don't reflect Stephen James, the current superintendent's administration. And I think they would argue that his practices are maybe different than his predecessors. But I think putting that in perspective, the practices that were in place for, up until 2024 are still the practices that govern, thousands of troopers that continue to patrol New York streets.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this conversation. We've been speaking with investigative journalist Sammy Sussman. Sammy, thank you so much for making the time, and congrats on the great reporting. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to today's edition of the Capitol Press Room. For an insider take on what's happening in state government, check out our Dispatches from Planet Albany show, available wherever you get podcasts or at capitolpressroom.org.
Join us again for Capitol Press Room, a production of WCNY Connected, Syracuse.